Hey, everybody, it's Pastor B. Open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 12. We're starting in verse 38, going all the way to verse 44 today. And the question we're going to answer today is, how do you spot a spiritual fraud? In fact, I've got a few examples throughout history just to get us started. First example, this guy, Pope Leo X, also known as Giovanni de' Medici. He was the Pope who encouraged the sale of indulgences to finance the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. You know, that was the whole thing that kind of sparked the Martin Luther, the whole Reformation era. One of the most famous frauds in all of history. Listen to the podcast if you want to learn a little bit more about what the indulgences were. Or how about this person? She's a little bit less well known. Her name was Joanna Southcott, and she was famous because she claimed to be a prophet. In fact, she had this trick. She said that she sealed away her prophecies in a wooden box. And then she died in 1814, and none of the prophecies had come true yet. And it wasn't until 1927 that some of her followers finally unsealed the box and found like no prophetic writings that actually were true. In fact, I think maybe they found a lottery ticket in there. But probably a better known fraud, at least to our generation, are the good old Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, founders of the PTL Club in the 1970s, founders of the Heritage USA Project, that Christian theme park and resort in Fort Mill, South Carolina. They sold lifetime memberships to that park, and it was all a fraud. He did some jail time. Their marriage didn't last. But the truth is, none of these frauds were the first spiritual frauds because Jesus encountered some in the text for today. Mark 12, starting in verse 38, says, Jesus also taught, beware of these teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in the synagogues and the head table at banquets. Jesus is calling out the scribes of his day, and he's showing them that really the first sign of fraud is kind of obvious. It's celebrity. Now, fame doesn't always lead to corruption, but the correlation was strong even in Jesus's day, just as it's strong today. For scribes back then, when they walked down the street or they passed through a marketplace, everyone was expected to rise before them, and they sat in the most important seats in the synagogues. They loved the fame, but they were frauds. That's what Jesus is saying. In fact, here's something else that Jesus says about the leaders in our churches. Luke 12, when someone has been given much, much will be required in return. And when someone has been entrusted with much, even more will be required. This is a warning to all of our spiritual leaders, you know, all of those celebrities in our churches today. And it doesn't make them frauds, but man, be careful because that place of leadership is really important. Jesus goes on in verse 40 and tells us the second sign of a fraud. And this is a little bit more subtle. It's hypocrisy. He says, yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, Jesus said, they will be more severely punished. For a spiritual fraud, there's a major gap between the outward show of religion and the real practice of righteousness in their everyday life. Now, it's not always noticeable to the human eye, but Jesus understood it. In fact, he said in Luke 12, verse 2, the time is coming when everything that is covered up will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. And Paul said this in 1 Timothy 5. Remember, the sins of some people are obvious, leading them to certain judgment, but there are others whose sins will not be revealed until later. So in the church, there are a lot of people, even sometimes leaders in the church, there are a lot of people who are hypocrites. We don't recognize it right away, but over time, as Jesus said in Luke 8, all that is secret will eventually be brought into the open. Now, look at the second part of this verse. It says, in the same way, the good deeds of some people are obvious, and the good deeds done in secret will someday come to light. And that leads us to the last part of our passage from Mark chapter 12 for today. It says in verse 41 that Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts, and then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. And Jesus called his disciples to him and he said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. So Jesus is contrasting here the fraud of the scribes with the generosity of this poor widow. If you want to learn a little bit more about the context, make sure to listen to the full podcast for this episode. But the bottom line is for Jesus, the value of a gift is not the amount given, but the cost to the giver. So we have these two examples. We have the scribes and we have this poor widow. And it brings us back to the question, how do you spot a fraud? There will always be frauds out there, but the real question hits closer to home. Are you a spiritual fraud? Think back on the lesson. Are you interested only in Christian celebrities? Are you religious outwardly, but you lack everyday holiness? Or maybe do you make excuses for not being generous? The irony is that poor woman who gave everything she owned, she gave it to a religious system that had failed. She essentially was giving it to the frauds, and yet she's commended for it. Some would call her foolish, but Jesus calls her great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says she's the genuine believer. So, what about you? Forget about all those frauds throughout history. Are you genuine in your faith?